Hello and welcome to the second edition of Gender Justice Nevada Quear 2.0. I am Laura Hernandez, Family and Youth Services Coordinator with Gender Justice Nevada. And welcome back to our show. I'm excited to be back here for our second time. And today what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about sex gender diversity. So what I do in my work is, besides advocating for youth, is training. And I train throughout the school district and then in other organizations in Nevada that work with the public and who are in need of a little bit of information and training on how to best work with the sex gender diverse population. So what I'm going to do is just go over a little bit of the information that I normally go over in my training, my intro training, and I'm hoping that will give you all out there who maybe don't have any experience knowing any of this, a little bit of information. What I like to focus on when I do my trainings is I don't look at it as if I'm training those who are working at various organizations on how to learn more about trans people as if they are a group that is separate from themselves. I don't train as if to say these are the things you should and shouldn't say, even though that's part of it, or this is the way that you should treat people that maybe fall within these categories. I think for me, it's always better to look at this information as how do these things affect all of us? So there is something called the gender binary system. And what that is it's a system that forces all people into one of two strictly defined gender categories, either man or woman. So men look a certain way, they act a certain way, they like certain things, they have certain jobs. Same thing for women. And those categories are very strictly enforced within our society. And we are all held to certain standards and expected to conform to those things, even though a lot of the time for us those things don't fit. We live in a society that's heteronormative. So what that means is that there's an expectation that men are masculine and that they are attracted to women, and that women are feminine and that they are attracted to men. And if you vary outside of that, of those two categories, then somehow you're looked at as being abnormal or not as you should be in some way. And the real truth of it is that both sexual orientation and gender identity fall along a spectrum, and that they differ from one person to the next, and those things don't have anything to do with one another. I'm going to talk more about that in a little while. But as I'm talking about these things, what I'd like for you all who are listening to think about is, how do these things affect you in your life? When was there a time in your life when you were told by someone that you couldn't do something because you were a man or because you were a woman, or it wasn't okay for you to like something or wear something or have a certain job, and that you felt pressure from society or parents or friends to behave in certain ways that maybe didn't fit for you? For that experience it's there for all of us. It's not just transgender folks who are experiencing these kinds of pressures to conform in ways that don't fit for them. It happens to all of us, just at varying degrees. Sex gender roles in our society are assigned before birth, right? So when somebody is pregnant, what's the first thing that we ask them? We say, is it a boy or is it a girl? What are we having? What is it? So it's an it. It's as if the baby is an it until it's gendered. You must become a man or a woman before you can actually be looked at as a human being. So it's the first box that we're put into as people, and that happens before we're even born. And then along with that comes a million expectations about who you're supposed to become, right? We take that information when a person's pregnant and they find out what the sex of the baby is, and we say, oh, now I know I'm having a girl, so I can make a girl's baby room. I can make it pink and frilly and fluffy, and I can buy lots of little baby girl dresses, and I have all these expectations about how my little girl is going to behave and act and what's appropriate for her and not appropriate for her. And I have these expectations based simply on the look or shape of her genitals, and we never really think about it like that, but that's really what it is. And women are expected in this society to have certain characteristics, such as they're supposed to be dependent, passive, gentle, nurturing, emotional. And men, on the other hand, are expected to be aggressive, dominant, tough, not nurturing or emotional. Right? Think about the things that we say to little boys in our society. We tell little boys, don't sit like that. You scream like a little girl. You don't throw that way. That's how a girl throws. Don't hold your hand that way. Don't stand in that way. It's as if we teach little boys that their masculinity is the most important thing that they have in this world, and that they have to cling tightly to that and protect it with everything that they have. Because if they don't have that, then who are they? It's as if they are only just not women, not feminine. But that's what's most important about being a man, is to not be a woman. And I think that when you look at it in that way, when you think about how the expectations that we place on little boys, it's no wonder that as men grow, that they tend to have very adverse reactions to those many times who are either gay or transgender. There are a lot of times when these kind of reactions come simply because a man's masculinity is threatened, either by another gay man or by a trans woman. You see that all the time with trans women being attacked simply for existing. Trans women just walking down the street, minding her own business. A man catcalls her and then realizes that she's a trans woman, and immediately he feels aggressive towards her and wants to attack her. Not because she's done anything, but simply because he feels threatened, or he feels that somehow he needs to prove his masculinity. And that's just a fact of life for both trans women and trans men living in our society. And it's really unfortunate. I'm going to talk a little bit about terminology. There are some terms that not everybody is familiar with. I think most people know what transgender means. So transgender means that you were assigned a sex at birth that doesn't match the identity or gender that you identify yourself as, right? So I have a child who is transgender. I had a child who I understood or believed to be a boy when she was born, and then later on in life she vocalized and identified as a girl, and that was my experience with her, and so she identifies as transgender. There's also cisgender. So I'm cisgender. Cisgender is the opposite, really, of transgender. It means that I was identified or assigned female when I was born, and I also identify as a female. So those things match for me. So that makes me cisgender. People sometimes ask me, why do we need a word for that? And the reason is that language is important. When we are referring to groups of people, it's not okay to say things like transgender people versus normal people or regular people, because there is no such thing as normal or regular people. We are all born in amazing varieties of every kind and shape and size and type. And so we need to, when we are referring to groups of people, have the language to represent everyone equally and respectfully. And so that's why it's important that we have words and labels. It's not as if it is something that is that defines anyone. I certainly don't define myself by the fact that I'm cisgender any more than my daughter defines herself by the fact that she's transgender. But it is it's important to have that language. Transition is also something that's important to understand. I think a lot of people believe that transition is the same for every trans person, or that somehow it will always end in surgery, that there's a path that every transgender person is on that has specific steps along the way, and that at some point they will make their final step and then become a real man or become a real woman. And it's just not like that. Transgender is, or transitioning is different for each individual person. And there are plenty of trans people that don't ever want to have any kind of surgery and are not concerned with doing that. And that doesn't make them not transgender, right? So being transgender doesn't equal surgery. You don't have to have surgery to be transgender. This transition is different for each individual, and a lot of times we hear things about kids who are transitioning. That must mean that they're having some kind of surgery. It must mean they're doing things medically. Transition doesn't necessarily mean that. What it generally means is when somebody goes from living in a way that they were, that's consistent with the gender that they were assigned at birth, to living with the gender that is more in alignment with how they understand themselves to be. And that can present itself in lots of ways. Sometimes it's just changing someone's name. Sometimes it is just changing the way that they present the clothes that they wear. Sometimes it does include things like hormone replacement therapy, and in lots of cases it does include surgery, but it's not the same for any person. And I think what's important to take away from that is that when we look at trans people, a lot of times we're very, very focused on people's genitals. They want to know, what do you have down there? And the reason I need to know that is because I want to know whether you're a real man or a real woman, or I need to know whether or not I can really respect you as who you say you are. And I think that the biggest lesson in all of that is that we're not our genitals, right? What if there was a man who was assigned male at birth, knows himself to be a man, was always a man, and he was in some sort of an accident and lost his genitals? Would he wake up the next morning and be a woman? Would he wake up the next morning and put a dress on and just be a woman because he no longer had the same genitals? He wouldn't, right? He knows who he is. He knows himself to be a man, and that's no different than any person who is cisgender and knows themselves to be a man or a woman. We know who we are, right? And we need to believe people when they tell us who they are. Another term is queer, right? So the show is called Quear 2.0. So what does that mean? When I was growing up, and I'm 40, could be 43. So when I was growing up, and I know for generations before me, that wasn't a nice term, right? That was a slur. It was something that was, at least in my experience growing up, I didn't even know what transgender was. So for me, I always understood that to be about those who were homosexual, right? So somebody who was queer was a slur to say that there was something wrong or different about them, and it wasn't a nice word, and it certainly wasn't something that somebody would identify with or call themselves. And that's changed. We really see a lot of the newer generations reclaiming that word, using it as in ways to self-identify in positive ways, and looking at that as just meaning anything that is outside of what is heteronormative, anything that's outside of what people in the general society view as what's supposed to be normal. But it can mean lots of different things. And there are still a lot of people that are from previous generations that are triggered by that word, that grew up with that being something that was very painful and hurtful to them, and it doesn't feel good to them even to hear those who identify in that way using that term. So it's just important to understand that there's a long history that exists with that. And that those who choose to use that to identify themselves have every right to do so. We all have the right to decide how we want to identify, how we want to express ourselves. Intersex is another term that is important to be aware of. So intersex, there's a lot of misconceptions about that. It's really just an umbrella term for a lot of various conditions that could affect someone's either their outward appearance of their genitals, or it could affect their chromosomes. There are a lot of people that are intersex that go their whole lives and are adults and they don't even know it until they have some sort of a scan. It might be a man who for all outward purposes looks as a man. It was identified male at birth, identifies as a man, has the genitals that you would expect a man that was assigned male at birth to have, and finds out late in life that he has undescended testicles that are actually ovaries. And so we see that that happen a lot. There are a lot of conditions that kind of fall in that category. It's there was a word growing up when I was growing up that is a hermaphrodite, and that's it's a dated term that is not a term that is it's kind of offensive at this time, and the correct term is intersex. And a lot of people understand what that means is that like people have two sets of genitals, but that's not really the case. A lot of times what happens is babies are born and there is some sort of ambiguity about what their genitals look like. They can't readily identify them as either male or female. And so unfortunately, a lot of times what happens is that there are surgeries performed on infants that are changing their genitals to be to look more masculine or more feminine, and not knowing how that child may identify later in life. And those are performed a lot of times with the parents thinking that they're doing the right thing because that's the information that they're getting from the doctors, and then it turns out later in life that those people end up with ongoing surgeries that they must continue to have for the rest of their lives to revise those. And anyone who knows about performing surgeries on infants, that those surgeries, as they grow, have to continuously be revised. And it's a pretty horrific experience for those children that have to go through that. And so we're hoping through the work that we're doing with Gender Justice Nevada to educate folks and help to make sure that those types of surgeries don't continue to happen. I'm going to talk about non-binary. So at the beginning of the show, I talked about the binary system. Again, that system that forces all people into one of two categories, man or woman. So there's this expectation that we have to be one or the other. You have to be a man or a woman. Pick one. And so being transgender doesn't always mean that you have a box, right? It doesn't always mean that I was born and assigned male at birth, and then I want to transition to being female, or vice versa. I'm just going to step out of one box and into the other. Some folks don't have a box. Some folks step out of the box that they were assigned at birth, and they just don't have one. They don't identify as either a man or a woman, or sometimes they might identify as both, or somewhere outside of that. And so that is generally called non-binary. Some folks use the term gender queer. And it would depend on the individual to decide how they best identify themselves. But it is important to know that this idea that we are stuck on in our society because of everything that we've ever been told, that there are men and there are women and that's it. And anything that's outside of that is somehow wrong, or people are sick or mentally ill, or that there's something wrong with them. It's just simply not true. Through all of history, there have been transgender folks. Throughout all of history, there have been intersex folks. Throughout all of history, there have been homosexual folks. And so these things aren't new. They're not a fad. They're not something that's ever going to go away. It's a part of the natural and normal variations of humankind. And getting to better understand how the variations that exist in our world can help us understand ourselves better and not hold ourselves so rigidly to those constraints that society places on us. Last thing, the terminology that I'm going to talk about is dysphoria. You hear that a lot, that term, dysphoria or gender dysphoria. So what dysphoria is a deep unease with parts of your body. Not all transgender people have dysphoria. Not all transgender people feel dysphoric or feel deeply a deep unease with their body, and many do. Right. So that again is something that is up to that individual, or that is unique to each individual. The idea that transgender people hate themselves or hate their bodies is simply not true. Though there are many, many trans people who do struggle with dysphoria, and that it can be incredibly difficult and crippling to many folks. So understanding what that might be like for somebody is really important. And if you're trying to understand the experience of somebody who's going through that. A lot of times we hear this idea, this term, born in the wrong body. We hear that often. And really what that is somebody who's cisgender trying to explain what the transgender experience is. And I think that there are many, many trans people that identify themselves in that way, and that may feel true for them. But making a blanket statement that's supposed to describe the experience of every transgender person by saying that they're just born in the wrong body, just simply so that you can use that to try to understand what they might be experiencing, isn't really helpful. I think there's nothing worse than the idea that you would assume that somebody was born in the wrong body or born wrong. So, my daughter was born in her body. That's her body. It's not someone else's body. She was born in her body. And she doesn't need to change it or alter it because someone else says that it's wrong. That doesn't mean that she won't at some point want to make changes, or that other trans people don't want to make changes to their bodies for various reasons, like many of us do, whether we're getting breast implants or nose jobs or whatever other ways that we alter or change our bodies. And so I think that, the real takeaway from that, is just to understand that, we all have various issues with ourselves and our bodies. And so to assume that somehow those who are trans hate themselves. Well, we got a couple minutes left, so I'm going to go ahead and take this call. Hello, you're on the air with Laura.
Hi, I just wanted to call and say thank you for doing the show, and I wanted to ask you a quick question. What's the difference between transgender and transsexual, and what's the difference? Is there a different meaning for them, or?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your question. Actually, there is. So transsexual is kind of a dated term, and it's also a medicalized term, right? So it's not really the best term to use when you're talking about the community. Transgender is a word that comes from the community, that is more of an umbrella term that includes a lot of different folks who identify in a lot of different ways. Transsexual is something that is a dated medicalized term that came to be about those who are making surgical changes to their bodies, and that doesn't necessarily fit for all of those who fall under the transgender umbrella. So it's definitely better to use that term transgender than transsexual. However, there are those from previous generations that have grown up with that term, that's the term they identify with, that's how they express and identify themselves, and there's certainly nothing wrong with them using that term to identify themselves.
Thank you. I have one more question. I was wondering, how does the transgender community feel about what Trump said, that he wasn't going to allow anybody like that in the Army?
Well, I think that nobody wants to be in amongst a group of people who are being singled out and having their rights taken away. And so that goes for anyone, whether or not they are someone who is currently serving in the military or would want to serve in the military. I think that we all deserve the right to serve our country if that's something that we choose, and to make a blanket statement that we won't, that a certain group of people won't be supported simply because they're viewed as too burdensome or too expensive in their medical care is really ridiculous. I mean, we look at, if you look at, like, say, for example, women serving in the military. Women can get pregnant at any time. Their pregnancies and their deliveries are costly. They lose time out of being able to be deployed after they've had their children. Nobody's suggesting or would ever suggest that we don't allow women to serve in the military simply because their care may be costly. And there are a million other examples in that same way. So it's certainly something that I don't believe is going to happen. I don't think that tweeting out something like that it just makes it so. And though he may think that that's the direction we're going, and I don't believe that is what's going to happen, because there's a huge community that is organized and that will be fighting against that happening.
All right. Well, thank you, and America's glad you're doing the show about this.
Thanks so much, and I'm glad that you called in.
Have a good day.
Thanks, you too. Bye-bye. So we got, how much time we got left? Like 4 minutes. So what I want to just real quickly go over before we're done is want to talk about the difference between sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. A lot of people think that transgender equals gay, right? So, and I used to think that too, right? I used to think when my daughter was little, she was so effeminate, and I used to think, well, I would at least I was going to have a gay son maybe. And then when I started to believe that maybe she was going to be transgender, that was really scary to me. And so I thought, can't you just be gay? Could you just be gay instead of being trans, as if somehow that was a choice? I used to think, that it was just sort of like a continuum. Like, you were just gay, and then you were super gay, and then so gay that you were transgender, which is silly for me to think about now. But I think that is how I thought about it, and I think a lot of people do think about it in that way, and it's not the same. Sexual orientation is about who you're attracted to, who you love, who you want your partner to be. Gender identity is about who you are and who you understand and know yourself to be. So those are different things, right? And then again, also, gender expression is also different. So gender expression is how we express ourselves, how we present ourselves to the world. So I feel, at this point in my life, that I'm more feminine. When I was younger, I was more of a tomboy because I equated masculinity with strength or power, because I had older brothers and I wanted to be tough like them. So I wore a lot of black and boys' clothes, and it wasn't until my 20s that I started to feel like I could actually be feminine and be powerful and strong. And so for me, my gender expression has changed over time, and a lot of times people's gender expression and even their gender identity can evolve and change over time. And the same is true for people's sexual orientation. That can evolve and change over time. And so those things are different, and it's important to know that there is a difference between them. Folks who are transgender can also be gay, but it would be, for example, if somebody was assigned male at birth and they transitioned to female and identify as female, and then that individual was attracted to and wants to date women, that would make that person a lesbian or a gay trans woman. For me, that was a really hard thing to wrap my mind around in the beginning, but it's become more and more clear to me over time how those things are different, and that's really, really important to understand when we're looking at that at this community. That we all have a sexual orientation, we all have a gender identity, we all have gender expression, and those things grow and change throughout our lives. So, what does that mean for you as a human being? I think the most important thing, at least for me in my experience, that I have gained from this journey that I'm on with my daughter and with Gender Justice Nevada, is that sex gender diverse people, they teach us about ourselves. They teach us about what it means to be authentic, about what it means to push back against barriers and boxes that society puts us into, and they help us to grow and to know ourselves better. A lot of these things we don't talk about or think about. We learn about who men are and who women are at a very young age, and then we're just stuck in that third grade way of thinking about this stuff, and we never really revisit it because it feels uncomfortable. It's important because these things make us grow as human beings. They have opened up an entirely new world, an entirely new understanding of myself than I had prior to being on this journey with my daughter, and I would never change a thing about it. It's really, truly one of the best things that's ever happened to me. It's been a gift in my life. I tell that to other parents who are new to the journey with their children, that one day they will look at this as a gift in their lives. And it's hard for them to believe that in the beginning because it feels so scary and overwhelming, and soon they come to find out that it truly is. And so I hope that you all that are listening will take something away from this and think a little bit more about how these things affect you in your own life. So we're coming up to the end, and so I hope you join us next week. We're going to be talking about myths and misconceptions about transgender people, and then we're going to do some focusing on myths and misconceptions about transgender youth. So thanks so much for being with us today, and we look forward to seeing you next week.